The Honourable Member for Nipissing Timiskaming.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to C14, the so-called Fairness at the Pumps Act. Fairness at the Pumps sounds good. It's a nice title, and it sounds like something that people are actually trying to do something good. Now, I've heard different variations on it coming from the Conservative Party. The Chislers Act, or getting back at the Chislers who are trying to rip people off for the gas that they're buying. You know, what it amounts to is vast and expensive changes to combat various variances, which in large part can be attributed to environmental changes and honest errors. Now, when we look at what's happened exactly over the past, looking at the amount of variance or error, studies show that 96% of gas pumps are precisely accurate. 96%. Now, that's not perfect, Mr. Speaker, but when we look at the difference, 4% are inaccurate. 2% favor the consumer. So when we look at it, okay, 96 of the 96, 2% of that 96 favor the consumer, so 4% of those pumps are off. So it's not like there's this big, massive problem out there, but I mean, it's nice to try to get 100%. The industry, the petroleum industry, is second, only after the apiary business. So when we look at the apiary industry, they're slightly better than the petroleum industry. What's more is, according to Alan Johnson, president of Measurements Canada, the majority of pumps that were out of tolerance by slightly over 1 tolerance. Okay, 1 tolerance is the equivalent of 0.5% discrepancy between the amount of gasoline paid and the amount dispensed. This means that the majority of pumps out of tolerance were about 1% off measurement. Now that's of that 4%. So you can see how minuscule that amount is. Now, I'm not justifying this, and I'm not saying it's okay to have variance, but what we have to look at is the amount of energy that's gone into this and how this actually comes out. And, they talk about it like there's a whole industry out there trying to rip off consumers. They vilified a group. Mr. Speaker, what I'm seeing here is a repeat of what we had in Ontario between 1995 to about, when we had a previous Conservative government in Ontario. Their modus operandi was they create a crisis. Mr. Speaker, they create a crisis and they vilify one group, one industry. In this part, it'll be the oil industry, but not so much the oil industry or the petroleum industry. They're vilifying the person at the pumps, the small operator. Mr. Speaker, we've seen this in Ontario. What we saw was Walkerton, where they just leave it up to the individuals to monitor themselves, and they'll hire their own private inspectors, not government inspectors, but private inspectors who will make a living off it going to different areas. When we look at private inspectors going in when needed or on a regular basis, what we're seeing is the industry regulating itself. Mr. Speaker, I have a small concern with that. I really do. Actually, it's a large concern with that because of what we did see in Ontario. Currently any report of fraud is investigated by a government inspector. This will not change under the new system. The only change is that every 2 years, station owners must pay $200 per pump for mandatory inspection, with no evidence of tampering or intentional discrepancy. That's $200 every 2 years. It doesn't sound like much, but when you have a number of pumps, it really causes a problem for small operators. Now, as was mentioned earlier, I look at Northern Ontario. Northern Ontario is a large territory with a sparse population, and we have small operators. They're not making millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. They're not making huge amounts pumping gas. They're providing a service. When we look at Northern Ontario, rural Canada, there's not a lot of operators. You might have one operator for maybe, I've seen it happen where people have to drive an hour to get gas, believe it or not. They have to get to that gas station, and if that operator is not doing the volume, he still has to get the inspection. And when you look at what causes pumps to go out, the temperature. In Northern Ontario, we have cold temperatures. That causes a bit of variation. But the major factor is the amount of pumping that gets done. When we look at something like Toronto, major center, we've got some stations there that just pump gas like it's going out of style, and it goes and goes, and there's some wear on there. Perhaps maybe the Conservatives would like to look at something like that and say, well, maybe they should be inspected more often. But they have 2 years right across the board. In Northern Ontario, in a rural area, you just don't get that volume. You don't get the wear and tear. So when we look at these operators in Northern Ontario or in rural Canada, they still have to get inspected every 2 years. Inspectors get paid $200 per year, or per pump. Northern Ontario is a vast area, as is rural Canada. Mr. Speaker, how many inspectors are going to be going to rural areas? Well, no, they're going to go where the fruit is lying low, and that's in major centers. So the inspectors will be in larger areas like the Torontos, the Vancouvers, the Ottawas, the larger centers. You start getting into smaller areas, and the operators will be at the mercy of the inspectors. And they'll be sitting there waiting and wondering when that's going to happen. And, Mr. Speaker, this is really going to cause some problems for the operators. And when we look at operators in rural areas, like Northern Ontario, what we see is there's independents. Many of the independents have been wiped out, they're gone, but a lot of these are small operators. So this adds to their cost that they'll have to pass on to the consumer. So, Mr. Speaker, this is actually adding cost to the operators or the people of Northern Ontario and rural Canada. If this was a problem solver, if it would put an end to all fraud at the pumps, then I'd say, this is really something that we should look at, and we should really embrace it and let it go ahead. But this bill will not stop those major fraudsters who are overcharging consumers. Only penalize pump owners, especially in rural regions where equipment is most likely to break down in inclement weather, whose equipment is off by less than 1%. And that's not a large amount. Yet, independents, small owners, they're going to be hit hard. And in turn, you're going to see less and less people say, why would I put myself up? And it's almost like they're being accused of they're guilty until proven innocent in something like this. So, and the way it's written and what's come up is that it's come to light showing that all people or all small companies who pump gas are fraudulent. They're all trying to chisel and trying to steal money from you. Mr. Speaker, that isn't so. The gas company, the people who pump gas are honest people who are trying to earn a living. There might be a little bit of variation, but there's variation in all businesses, in all industries. So, when you look at it, about 0.0002% of the gasoline bought by Canadians last year didn't end up in their cars. 0.2 of 1%. Even anybody who looks at that sees it as a small amount. It's not a large amount. I'm not saying it's insignificant, but it's something that should be considered because, 5/10,000ths of 1% is not a huge amount. Not when you see the variation in gasoline going up and down. It swings. I mean, just in my community the other day, it went from 96 cents to $1.08. And, had they been measuring better, it would not have made any difference. It would not made a bit of difference. So, when I look at what the Conservatives have talked about in the past, about their taking the GST off once it got over 85 cents, all kinds of neat things that sounded good but weren't acted on, this is a pittance, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's basically playing Canadians for fools. And it makes people feel good when they read the title, but unfortunately, that's where it ends. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Gaspésie-Île-de-la-Madeleine.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Moi, ce que j'aimerais entendre de la part de la personne qui vient tout juste de parler, c'est de nous expliquer davantage les réticences qu'elle peut avoir versus le fait qu'en bout de ligne, il ne faudrait pas que ce soit le consommateur qui soit le payeur là-dedans. Il faut trouver un moyen pour faire en sorte que oui, on améliore le système, mais si améliorer le système, ça fait en sorte qu'éventuellement, on paiera plus cher à la pompe, on avance où? Et je me demandais s'il avait déjà songé à tout ça et quelles étaient éventuellement les façons de procéder ou encore quelle vision il aurait par rapport à ça lorsqu'on va pouvoir l'étudier en comité notamment. Et je pense que ces commentaires seraient fort appréciés parce qu'ils nous permettraient de nous préparer tous et toutes à faire un excellent travail au niveau du comité.
The honourable member for Nipissing-Timiskaming.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. C'est une bonne question. C'est très important parce que quand on regarde à cette motion, sur ce projet de loi, on voit que les gens pensent, OK, on va être finalement, on va pas payer les frais qui vont être, on va pas nous faire, c'est quoi le bon mot, ils vont pas nous voler de l'argent. Mais la meilleure chose, c'est de faire sûr qu'il y a un projet de loi qui vient en place, qui fait une différence, qui va faire une différence. Puis c'est pas quelque chose où on donne, où on fait payer un peu plus, puis en fin de compte, il n'y a pas de différence. Alors, quelque chose comme ça, ce projet de loi cause des problèmes pour la compagnie, l'individu qui vend le pétrole, mais ça ne fait pas une différence pour le prix du pétrole. Et c'est ça qui est le problème. Alors, quand les conservateurs ont commencé de parler des changements, ils ont parlé des changements au prix, des limites au prix du pétrole. C'est ça qu'ils parlaient en 2004. Ils voulaient arrêter le prix de monter. Ils voulaient faire sûr qu'il n'y avait pas de différence entre ce qu'on payait à Toronto et ce qu'on paye dans le nord de l'Ontario, ce qu'on paye à Vancouver et dans le nord de la Colombie-Britannique. On voulait quelque chose qui était juste pour tout le monde. Alors c'est ça qu'il faut chercher. Quelque chose qui prend en compte ce qu'on paye aux pompes, que ce soit dans les gros centres ou dans le rural.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
I thank my colleague for his inputs. A question for him. An earlier colleague from the Liberal Party spoke about the despair he felt around acts like this because they proclaim in their name fairness at the pump, give Canadians the impression that that's what's actually going to happen, but only move the ball a few inches down the field when a penny here or there might be saved from the whole effort that we're putting behind this bill, whereas the large question about the potential abuse of some companies in price fixing has been attempted many times, but the rules don't allow government to come to the actual conclusion that's in front of all of us, which is companies seem to elevate their prices at various times of the year and consumers get hit. And it's not pennies. It can add up to many dollars every time we fill up, and across the country, that can mean millions of dollars. This didn't happen with the Conservative government over the last 5 years, but it didn't happen either under the previous Liberal regime. Are the Liberals now saying that they're willing to work with us to actually provide consumer protection, change the fundamental rules so that Canadians can be protected from gouging at the pump?
Absolutely.
The honourable member for Nipissing-Timiskaming. Short answer,
Thank you.
please.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. It's nice to hear that he's willing to work with us to make a difference, because we haven't seen that. I remember in 2004 where his leader actually knocked out the Liberals so that they could possibly get a couple of seats, and we lost a lot, Mr. Speaker. It was really painful. But let's go to fairness at the pumps. Fairness at the pumps is what the honourable member mentioned, and it's about the title. Sounds like there's actually something being done, and it sounds like it's there. But, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, this is a repeat of Ontario under a Conservative government. You create a crisis, you get the troops all rallied, they rush behind, and then when they realize that we're all rushing in one direction, what happens is the issue wasn't there at all. It was somewhere else. This is a diversion, Mr. Speaker. This is a diversion that the Conservatives are using to make themselves sound good, to feel good, but it's not solving the problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.